When we're struggling, God sometimes seems to be moving slowly. However, when we emerge from difficult times, looking back, we may celebrate God's timing and realize that he knew what he was doing and he was in control. And there's lots and lots of occasions in the past where, looking back, I've realized that God's timing was absolutely perfect. I remember, for instance, back in 1975, I applied to go to what used to be called London Bible College, and eventually I went in 1982, 7 years later. The Baptist Union turned me down in 1984, but then in 1986 they accepted me. And there was a church I particularly wanted to go to in 2003 to be the pastor, but that door closed. And then instead, I surprised myself by going to the north of England, to Lancashire, for 10 years for very exciting ministry from 2004. And there's many other examples that I could tell you where it's only looking back that I've actually realised that God knew what he was doing and that his timing was much better than the timing that I had in mind. Well, that's true with God's people generally, and as we look at the stories of God's people in the Bible, we see that over and over again. And there was a time when the Israelites felt that they needed a king, a human king. They were envying other nations that were prospering, or apparently prospering under kings. And God, somewhat reluctantly, we read, gave them what they wanted. But it really wasn't God's time for them to have a human king. And they should have waited for him. And instead, Saul ended up as the first king of Israel. Someone who looked great, but actually God couldn't trust Saul, and neither could his people. And what we want to look at this morning is the fact that Saul eventually was rejected by God. He was rejected even though he was God's choice, permissive choice, to be Israel's first king, and he did make a great start. But unfortunately, power went to his head. He believed he didn't answer to anybody, and God rejected him. We read, in fact, in 1 Samuel chapter 15, words of Samuel the prophet to King Saul: "You have rejected the word of the Lord, and the Lord has rejected you as king over Israel." Now, today I'm in one of my favourite places in the city of Coventry, this lovely old cathedral. It's great to be here today. A few people walking around, the sun shining. We wait for the bells to interrupt this sermon. Almost inevitably that will happen. We won't worry too much about that. But this cathedral it is very much a representation of the city of Coventry over many years. And what I'm hearing from people is that back in the Second World War, that the citizens of this city felt rejected by Winston Churchill, no less, because Churchill knew that the Germans were planning to bomb this city, and he did nothing about it because there was a bigger picture in terms of not wanting the Germans to know that their Enigma code had been broken. And so agonizingly, he allowed this bombing plan to go ahead. And understandably, the people that lived in Coventry, when they realised what had happened, they felt very rejected. They felt very rejected in terms of that decision by Winston Churchill. Rejection, it's a common human experience, sadly, and one almost inevitably that you have gone through in the past. Maybe at this time you are feeling rejected, maybe by a particular person. Saul was rejected in our Bible passage today, 1 Samuel chapter 15, 24 to 35, if you'd like to read it. He felt rejected. He was rejected. God rejected him as king of Israel because he was disobedient. Now, does God reject us? That's a good question, isn't it? Sometimes it feels that God has rejected us, but let me tell you, he doesn't reject us. He is forgiving, but disobedience has its consequences. And it's possible as God's people that we may lose certain privileges if we turn our backs on God and if we don't do what he's telling us to do. And that's certainly what happened to Saul. His kingship was taken away from him. But for us, we should never doubt that God loves us. Never doubt that he will give us second chances. But never doubt also that disobedience has inevitable consequences. So Saul felt rejected. He was rejected. And I also want to talk about the prophet Samuel. because Samuel was very dejected in terms of what happened to Saul. And we read in our passage, until the day Samuel died, he did not go to see Saul again, though Samuel mourned for him. Samuel mourned for Saul. I wonder whether Samuel blamed himself. I wonder whether he was frozen with grief. I wonder whether he was imprisoned by negative emotions. Certainly it's clear that at that time Samuel needed to find closure and to move on. So I'm wondering whether you feel dejected at this time because someone has let you down in the way that Samuel felt let down by Saul. Do you feel let down by someone recently or in the distant past and you still haven't got past that, you haven't got over it? Maybe you're trapped in the past. Maybe you need to climb out of that pit of dejection. Forgiving other people is very important. Sometimes it's very hard to do. But ultimately, if we don't forgive others, we're probably hurting ourselves more than that other person. And here come those bells that I promised you. Let me share with you a Welsh proverb as I fight the bells. A Welsh proverb says that you chew on your own tongue when you chew on resentment. I'll repeat that. The Welsh proverb says you chew on your own tongue when you chew on resentment. So we need to get over the negative emotions we feel when other people have let us down. Otherwise we will continue to feel dejected as Samuel did. So, King Saul, outwardly he looked great, but inwardly he didn't look quite so good. Of course, God could see what he looked like on the inside, and that's ultimately all that really counts as far as God is concerned. Now, if you're hearing this message before 10:30 on the morning of 18th of October, then you'll get the chance, if you're coming on Zoom or if you're going to be in the building for our service, to actually hear the sequel to this sermon, which is going to be all about Saul's successor, the second king of Israel, who's actually my favourite Old Testament character. But for now, we conclude by saying that God had to fire Saul as the king of Israel. We conclude by saying that Samuel, the prophet Samuel, felt let down by Saul, that he had a roller coaster experience in trying to move on. But we're going to look at the next chapter on the 18th of October. If you're hearing this before then do join us as we look at 1 Samuel chapter 16, verses 1 to 13. So often in the Bible, we read about the failure of God's people, but also we see that very often failure leads to success for individuals, for the people of Israel, and maybe that's true or can be true for us at this time. We're struggling with failure, but perhaps success is just around the corner if we move on from what's happened and put our trust in God. So my closing salvo to you: don't get trapped in the past. Don't get trapped in the past. Find a way to move on. Look to God to help you. Maybe talk to an experienced Christian leader or counsellor who can help you. God has got new things for you. Hear this message today. God has got new things for you. Let's be excited about that. Let's believe in that. Let's live in that certainty. Thank you so much for listening.